The boardroom was built to intimidate, floor-to-ceiling glass, a table long enough to make distance feel deliberate, screens glowing with numbers that decided people's futures. Daniel Hayes sat at the far end, hands folded over a worn leather notebook. Navy suit, no cufflinks, no performance. Outside the glass wall, in a quiet waiting area, his 8-year-old daughter Lily sat cross-legged with a tablet and oversized headphones, swinging her feet gently above the polished floor. Victoria Langford noticed her before she noticed anything on the slide deck. She paused mid-sentence. "I'm sorry," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Did someone bring their child to a board meeting?" A few restrained smiles flickered around the table. Daniel didn't move. "My daughter's school closed unexpectedly this morning." Victoria's gaze sharpened. "So you thought this was appropriate?" "This isn't daycare, Mr. Hayes." A low ripple of laughter followed. "Not cruel, not kind, just convenience." Through the glass, Lily looked up at the sound. Daniel felt it, but his expression didn't shift. "I understand," he said evenly. Victoria leaned back. "Do you?" "Because investors flew in from 3 states away. We're voting on a 400 merger. Optics matter." Optics. The word hung heavier than it should have. She tapped her pen against the table. "And authority matters. It's difficult to project leadership when you're managing childcare logistics." Or laughter. Slightly louder this time. Daniel inhaled. One so slow, measured. "I understand," he repeated. "But there's something in the queue for projections you should see before the vote." Victoria didn't hesitate. "Your memo was reviewed. It wasn't addressed. It was deemed non-material." Silence pressed in. Daniel's eyes didn't challenge her. They didn't plead either. They simply held steady. "There's an anomaly in the clinical carryover data," he said. "It affects exposure forecasting." Marcus Klein, the CFO, gave a dismissive chuckle. "We've already stress-tested that model." Daniel nodded once. "Not the current version." Victoria's tone cooled further. "Mr. Hayes, this meeting will proceed as scheduled. If you have concerns, schedule them through proper channels." Through the glass, Lily shifted in her seat, sensing something she couldn't name. Daniel closed his notebook gently. "Understood." Victoria moved on. 7 minutes later, she wouldn't be able to. And the laughter still hanging in the room would sound very different. The problem wasn't that Daniel brought his daughter. The problem was that no one had asked why he was so calm. That morning had started long before the glass boardroom and the polished laughter. It started in a small kitchen with chipped white cabinets and sunlight that slipped in quietly, like it didn't want to wake anyone. Daniel stood behind Lily with a brush in his hand, studying her reflection in the microwave door as if it were a technical diagram. "Hold still," he murmured. "I am holding still," she said, which meant she wasn't. He divided her hair into 3 uneven sections. He watched the tutorial twice. It never looked this complicated online. "You're pulling too tight." "I'm not." "You are." He loosened his grip immediately. On the stove, pancake batter sizzled. Daniel checked it, then poured a second round carefully into a mold he'd found buried in a drawer months ago. It had been his wife's idea, small rituals that made ordinary mornings feel intentional. 3 years ago, Claire had owned this kitchen with effortless intelligence. Data scientist, precision, thinker. She used to braid Lily's hair without looking, discussing predictive modeling while flipping pancakes with the other hand. Daniel glanced at the framed photo on the fridge. Claire mid-laugh whined in her hair. The voicemail came as he slid the star-shaped pancake onto a plate. "Due to a major plumbing emergency, Jefferson Elementary will be closed today." He stood still for a moment. Phone pressed to his ear long after the message ended. Lily looked up from the table. "Is it a snow day?" "No," he said gently. "Just water doing what water does." He calculated options the way he always did. Neighbor, out of town, babysitter, away at college, remote work. Impossible today. Board vote. He stared at the calendar on the wall. $400 million. Regulatory exposure. A memo no one wanted to read. And an 80-year-old who needed somewhere safe. "I can stay home by myself," Lily offered carefully. He turned too fast. "No." She watched his face and nodded. She understood tone better than most adults. He crouched in front of her. "You're coming with me. But you'll have to be very patient," she grinned. "I can be invisible." He almost smiled at that as she ate her pancake. She studied him across the table. "Daddy, they know you're the smartest one there." He paused, fork halfway to his mouth. "Why would you think that?" "Because you fix things they don't even know are broken. Children see patterns adults overlook." He reached across the table and wiped syrup from her cheek. "They don't need to know," he said softly. He stood to rinse the dishes, and the light caught the ring still on his left hand. He hadn't taken it off, not out of denial, out of continuity. Some structures shouldn't be dismantled just because they hurt. When they stepped out the door, he hesitated with his hand on the car handle. He could call in sick, he could send another email, no one would answer, he could choose safety instead. He opened the passenger door for Lily. Responsibility rarely waits for comfort. Hours later, in a room built on optics and authority, Laughter pressed against glass, and Daniel, who had once braided hair with mathematical precision and burned the first pancake without complaint, sat at the end of a corporate empire that had mistaken restraint for weakness. The tension from that laughter still lingered in the air. The slide on the screen read, ***, strategic acquisition, Elishera Biotech, $400 million. Projected market expansion, 18%. Projected regulatory risk, minimal. The word minimal hovered in bold blue font, clean and confident. Victoria stood at the head of the table, posture immaculate, voice measured. She did not rush her sentences. She did not repeat herself. Control, in her world, was demonstrated through tempo. This acquisition positions us 5 years ahead of our competitors, she said. Helixera's oncology pipeline fills our most critical development gap. Across the table, investors nodded. A few leaned forward, sensing momentum. Markets rewarded speed. Hesitation looked like weakness. Marcus Klein clicked to the next slide. Charts rose in smooth upward arcs. Synergy realization within 18 months, he said. Cost redundancy is absorbed by Q3 next fiscal year. He didn't look at Daniel. He didn't need to. 3 weeks earlier, Daniel had submitted a 42-page memo outlining irregularities in Helixera's Phase 3 trial data. Not accusations. Not alarmism. Just patterns. Adverse events that had been statistically smoothed into an insignificance. Patient dropout clusters that aligned to neatly with reporting deadlines, an anomaly in exposure modeling that suggested liability, far beyond what the acquisition price reflected. The memo had been acknowledged with a aligned email. Thank you for your thoroughness. We've reviewed and determined the risk profile remains within acceptable parameters. Acceptable to whom? Daniel had wondered. The algorithm flagged it before he did. He had built that algorithm 2 years earlier during a compliance overhaul. No one wanted to fund predictive modeling layered with regulatory trend analysis. It scanned trial data against historical enforcement triggers, identifying where optimism blurred into exposure. At the annual shareholder meeting, Marcus had presented it as a finance-led innovation initiative. Daniel had watched from the third row while polite applause filled the auditorium. He hadn't corrected him. Recognition was optional. Accuracy was not. Victoria resumed speaking. Our legal team has completed due diligence. We have no indication of material non-compliance. Material. Daniel glanced at his worn leather notebook. Inside were handwritten notes, timestamps, cross-references, probability ranges. His watch, simple stainless steel, ticked softly against the table when he shifted his wrist around him. Tailored suits, discreet luxury watches, shoes that reflected the boardroom lights. Glass walls reflected everything back, larger than it was. Victoria's gaze passed over him briefly. The way one acknowledges infrastructure necessary but interchangeable, unless there are final objections. She said, I'd like to move toward a preliminary approval vote. Marcus folded his hands, satisfied. Speed was strategy. Delay was expense. Daniel felt the pressure in the room change. Decisions at this level weren't about information. They were about narrative. Momentum once established became difficult to interrupt without appearing disruptive. He understood hierarchy. He respected structure. But data did not respond to authority. The anomaly had grown since his memo. He had rerun the model twice last night after Lily fell asleep on the couch. Each simulation tightened the same conclusion. If the merger proceeded, under current disclosures, regulatory freeze within 12 months was not hypothetical. It was probable. And freezes invited investigations. Investigations invited exposure. Exposure erased market confidence faster than any competitor could. Marcus adjusted his cufflinks. We've already stress-tested the projections, he added, lightly, as if anticipating dissent. Stress-tested which version? Daniel thought. The current model was not the one. Marcus believed it was. The external audit flag embedded deep within the compliance system. The one designed to trigger independent review when risk threshold spiked had been manually disabled 3 weeks ago. The same week, Daniel's memo was archived. He hadn't mentioned that yet. Victoria glanced around the table, all in favor of advancing the acquisition to bind the agreement. Daniel lifted his hand slightly, not dramatically, just enough. The room didn't stop exactly.
It's paused.
Victoria's eyes returned to him, cool but controlled.
Yes, Mr.
Hayes. His voice was steady, not defensive, not confrontational. There's one projection in queue for exposure modeling that hasn't been fully examined, he said. It won't take long. Marcus exhaled through his nose. Investors shifted. Impatience surfacing. Victoria studied him for a beat too long. This was the moment where middle management usually retreated instead. Daniel opened his notebook before we vote, he said quietly. There's something you need to see. Victoria didn't sigh, but the room felt like she had. One slide, she said. Keep it concise. The concession sounded generous. AWASN single quotes T. Daniel rose without hurry and walked to the screen. He didn't carry a stack of binders or a dramatic presentation deck, just a slim laptop and a cable he connected himself. The display shifted. A clean chart appeared first, nothing alarming at a glance. Projected oncology outcomes plotted against reported adverse events. Helixera's published data suggested adverse reactions decline in phase 3. Daniel began. That's statistically unusual but not impossible. Marcus leaned back. Because it isn't impossible. Daniel clicked once. The graph recalibrated. Same data, different smoothing parameter. The decline flattened. Another click. The decline inverted. A faint murmur moved around the table. They used a rolling average model, Daniel said calmly. Perfectly legal. But when you isolate event clusters, by reporting window rather than aggregate quarter, the pattern changes. He highlighted a section in red. These clusters align with internal review deadlines. Patients experiencing complications were disproportionately categorized as protocol deviations rather than adverse reactions. The room quieted, not dramatically, but enough to be felt. Marcus leaned forward now. You're reframing statistical interpretation. I'm removing cosmetic smoothing. Victoria's voice entered, controlled but firmer. Mr. Hayes, our external advisors signed off on this data. Daniel nodded. On the version provided, another click, a new slide appeared. Dense, layered, probability bands and predictive enforcement triggers. This is our internal compliance algorithm, he said. The one implemented 2 years ago. Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. It cross-references clinical variance against historical. Second, FDA enforcement actions. When risk probability exceeds a defined threshold, it triggers an independent audit flag. Victoria's gaze sharpened. We're aware of how our system functions. Daniel met her eyes evenly. Then you're also aware that 3 weeks ago, that external audit flag was manually disabled. Silence. Not loud. Not explosive. Just sudden. Marcus spoke first. That's inaccurate. Daniel didn't look at him. He clicked again. Timestamp logs filled the screen. Override. Authorization. Date. Time. Credential ID. Marcus shifted in his chair. That was a temporary adjustment during integration testing. Daniel's tone did not rise. The integration testing period ended 2 months ago. A board member cleared his throat. Victoria's composure thinned but only slightly. Even if what you're suggesting is technically accurate, it doesn't equate to regulatory violation. No, Daniel agreed. Not yet. Hugh zoomed into a forecast band on the chart. This projects exposure trajectory if acquisition proceeds under current disclosures. 90-day window. He let the number sit there. 90 days until probability of formal inquiry exceeds 70%, he continued, based on precedent cases with comparable variance. Marcus let out a short laugh. Predictive speculation. Daniel closed his laptop halfway, not defensively, decisively. It's not speculation, he said. It's pattern recognition. Victoria folded her hands. You're proposing we halt a $400 million merger. Based on hypothetical enforcement modeling, I'm proposing we delay until full variance disclosure is reconciled. Her gaze cooled further. Or what? Daniel held it. If we proceed today, he said quietly, the SEC will freeze this merger within 90 days. The sense didn't echo, but settled. A chair creaked somewhere near the middle of the table. Marcus scoffed. That's fear-based obstruction. Daniel didn't flinch. It's risk calibration. Victoria stood slowly, reclaiming physical command of the room. You've made your caution clear, she said. But leadership requires discernment between diligence and paralysis. There it was. The framing. Boldness versus fear. Vision versus hesitation. She looked around the table. Gathering silent alleys. We cannot operate from a posture of perpetual defensiveness. Daniel remained where he was, hands resting lightly on the laptop lid. I'm not defensive, he said. I'm precise. A subtle crack had formed not in the data, but in the atmosphere. Board members exchanged glances that were no longer purely impatient. Curiosity had entered the room, and curiosity was harder to control than agreement. Victoria sensed it. Her tone sharpened just enough to remind everyone who chaired the table, you're making a serious assertion. Mr. Hayes, she said, freezing a merger of this scale isn't trivial. I know. Then you understand the burden of proof rests entirely on you. Daniel nodded once. Round the table, whispers began soft, contained. But spreading. Control was no longer absolute. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. Right, well, she said. If you're so certain, prove it. Daniel reopened his laptop fully this time. The screen shifted from presentation slides to something denser. Raw architecture. Layered dashboards. Code overlays. Financial exposure maps intersecting with regulatory timelines. This wasn't a summary. This was the engine. I didn't just review the acquisition data, he said evenly. I've rebuilt its risk pathway inside our system. Numbers moved as he adjusted variables in real time. Enforcement probability recalculated. Market impact projections narrowed into sharper bands. A board member leaned forward. How are you modeling federal response cycles at precisely? Daniel didn't hesitate. Because I used to design them. The room stilled again. He didn't dramatize it. He simply stated it. Before joining this company, I worked in federal regulatory analytics. My team developed enforcement trigger models for multi-state securities investigations. Marcus's expression flickered just briefly. Daniel continued. Tone unchanged. I left 3 years ago. He didn't explain further, but the absence of explanation carried its own weight. 3 years ago was when Claire died, when visibility stopped mattering. I didn't include that background in my internal bio, he added. It wasn't relevant to my assigned role. Victoria studied him differently now, not as infrastructure, but as concealed architecture. On the screen, Daniel isolated the compliance algorithm's audit flag module. This subsystem, he said, was designed to initiate mandatory third-party review when variance exceeded 22% above historical enforcement tolerance. He pulled up the log history.timestamp, user credential, manual override. Marcus shifted in his chair. That override was procedural. Daniel magnified the log metadata. The credential ID corresponds to executive-level authorization, he said, specifically the CFO's access tier. The air tightened. Marcus's jaw hardened. Integration testing required temporary suppression of automated alerts. Daniel nodded. Integration testing concluded 61 days prior to this override. It clicked again. A parallel timeline appeared. Helixera's updated adverse event report submission, filed 48 hours after the flag was disabled. Correlation glowed without needing commentary from the hallway beyond the glass. Lily had stopped, swinging her feet. She watched her father through the transparent wall, sensing the gravity even if she couldn't pass the data. She knew this look on his face. It was the one he wore when fixing something broken. Inside the room, Victoria's posture changed. Subtly. Not collapse. Calculation. You're implying intent, she said carefully. I'm presenting sequence. Marcus leaned forward, voice tightening. This is circumstantial layering. You're constructing narrative from system noise. Daniel met his gaze for the first time since beginning. If it were noise, he said calmly, it wouldn't align across financial exposure, clinical variance, and enforcement probability within a 12-hour reporting window. No raids, voice, no accusation to structure. Victoria's eyes moved between the screen and Marcus. The realization wasn't loud, but it was visible. The person she had dismissed minutes earlier understood the company's internal infrastructure more intimately than anyone else in the room, including her data infrastructure. Once understood, couldn't be easily dismissed. The board members were no longer whispering. They were watching, not Daniel. Victoria. Waiting to see which direction authority would lean. Integrity or loyalty, risk recalibration or narrative control. Victoria straightened slightly, reclaiming composure the way seasoned leaders do, not through denial, but through procedure. We're taking a recess, she said. 15 minutes. Her tone left no room for debate. Chairs moved. Conversations began in hushed clusters. Marcus remained seated a fraction too long. Daniel closed his laptop. Gently. The reversal hadn't happened yet, but the foundation had shifted and everyone in the room could feel it. Victoria's office overlooked the city like it owned it. Glass on 3 sides. Silence engineered into the walls. A space designed to remind anyone standing inside it who carried consequence. Daniel remained near the doorway until she gestured to a chair. This doesn't need to become adversarial, she began. Tone smoother now. Measured. Strategic. You're clearly intelligent. Thorough. Perhaps underutilized. Underutilized. The word sounded different here than it had in the boardroom. You built a system none of us fully appreciated, she continued. That's on leadership. A pause. I'd like to correct that. Daniel said nothing. Victoria folded her hands. Reframe your conclusion. Present it as elevated technical caution, not projected enforcement certainty. With delay announcement, adjust disclosures quietly, stabilize the narrative. She watched him carefully. In return, I restructured the compliance division. You lead it. Executive title. Compensation aligned accordingly. Compensation aligned accordingly. Tuition funds. Medical coverage. A safety net that didn't depend on surviving quarterly politics. You have a daughter, Victoria added gently. Stability matters. There it was. Not a threat, an offering. Daniel felt the weight of it more than he had felt the laughter. Lily sitting outside the boardroom earlier, pretending not to notice the tone. Her collie someday. The mortgage, quiet fear every single parent carries but never names. For a moment, just a moment, he imagined saying yes, adjusting phrasing, softening certainty into probability, allowing time to bury the variance deep enough that no one could trace its origin. No scandal, no disruption, security in the stillness. Another voice surfaced on in the room, but in memory. Claire, at the kitchen table, laptop open, late-night lamplight catching the edge of her glasses. Data doesn't lie, she had said once, without looking up. People do, usually because they're afraid. Afraid of losing status. Afraid of losing comfort. Afraid of telling the truth. Too soon Daniel looked at Victoria. I'm not trying to damage the company, he said quietly. I know, but reframing it doesn't change the exposure. It buys us time. It buys narrative. Victoria's jaw tightened slightly. Leadership is narrative. Integrity isn't. Silence settled between them. He thought of Lily asking if they knew he was the smartest one there. They don't need to. He straightened in the chair. I won't sign off on something that harms patients, he said. Calm/final, not dramatic. Not angry, just immovable. Victoria's expression shifted in that explosive anger. Not disbelief. Something colder. Calculation recalibrating. You understand, she said carefully. That public contradiction at this level has consequences. I do, and you're prepared for them. I am. The city skyline reflected faintly in the glass behind her, fractured by vertical seams. For the first time since the meeting began, she wasn't negotiating from dominance. She was evaluating risk, not financial. Personal. Joshi stood very well. No warmth, no threat, just decision. When they returned to the boardroom, the energy had changed. Conversations cut short as they entered. Marcus looked up quickly, searching Victoria's face for signal. Daniel resumed his seat at the end of the table. Lily watched through the glass. The vote had not yet happened, but something else had, and everyone in the room could feel it. Victoria resumed her seat at the head of the table as if nothing had fractured. Thank you for your patience, she said, voice steady. We'll proceed with final clarification before moving to vote. Clarification. Not correction. Not conflict. Control. Reasserted through language. She gestured lightly toward Daniel. Mr. Hayes has raised technical concerns. We'll allow him a final summary. The word allow hovered in the air. Daniel stood again, not hurried, not hesitant. He connected his laptop once more, but this time he bypassed the earlier slides entirely. A new dashboard filled the screen timeline. Projection. 90 days mapped in incremental escalation points. This model integrates 3 variables. Daniel began. Unreported, adverse clustering, audit flag suppression, and post-acquisition disclosure obligations. He zoomed in on the first marker. Day 21. Internal analyst at Helixora notices reporting discrepancy during integration. Next marker. Day 38. Anonymous inquiry submitted through federal whistleblower portal. A subtle shift rippled through the room. Marcus leaned back, arms folding too tightly. Daniel continued. Day 52. Preliminary inquiry letter. Issued requesting expanded trial documentation. He didn't embellish. He didn't speculate beyond the model. They said trading volatility triggered by disclosure rumor. The next slide showed projected market reaction curves, confidence erosion, credit tightening, class action exposure. And by day 90, Daniel said quietly, merger freeze pending formal investigation. He stepped slightly aside so the numbers spoke unobstructed. This isn't worst-case modeling, he added. It's median trajectory based on 12 comparable enforcement cases over the last decade. A board member cleared his throat. What's the probability threshold? 72%. Silence deepened. Not disbelief. Calculation. 1 of the investors turned slowly toward Marcus, then another. The room's center of gravity shifted without announcement. Victoria's hands remained folded, but the stillness in her posture was different now. Not dominance. Containment. Mr. Klein, she said evenly, eyes never leaving him. Can you explain the override logs? Marcus's confidence faltered, not dramatically, but enough. As I stated earlier, it was procedural. Temporary. Victoria's gaze did not blink. Why was it not reinstated? A pause. We were in the middle of acquisition modeling that concluded weeks ago. Another pause. Longer. Marcus looked around the table, searching for alignment that wasn't there. The risk signal was overstated, he said finally. I exercised executive discretion. Without documentation? A board member asked. With operational efficiency. Daniel said nothing. He didn't need to. The timestamp logs still glowed on the screen 7 minutes earlier. This had been a formality. 7 minutes earlier, laughter had filled the space where doubt now sat. Victoria inhaled slowly. The realization reached her, not as embarrassment, but as recognition. The architecture of authority depends on accurate information, and she had nearly approved a decision built on suppressed data. She turned back to Daniel, and for a brief second, the hierarchy that had defined the morning dissolved into something more elemental. Credibility. She rose. This meeting is adjourned pending independent forensic audit, she said. Effective immediately. The words were precise, controlled. External counsel will review the override and all related disclosures. Chairs shifted sharply now. Conversations erupted in low, urgent tones. Marcus remained seated, color draining subtly from his face as 2 compliance officers approached at Victoria's quiet signal. This is unnecessary, he muttered. It's procedure, Victoria replied. He stood, smoothing his jacket, attempting to salvage dignity on the way out. No one laughed. No one looked at Daniel with triumph either. They looked at him with reassessment. He closed his laptop gently. The click of it final but not theatrical. He did not smile. He did not look toward Victoria for acknowledgement to truth. Had done its work without spectacle. As the room emptied into corridors of hushed speculation, the glass walls reflected something different than they had at the beginning of the meeting. Not power. Consequence. Daniel gathered his notebook. The same worn leather, unchanged by the shift it had helped create. There would be fallout. There always was. Reputations bruised, loyalties tested, possibly his own position reconsidered once the dust settled. The victory inside institutions rarely arrives without cost. He understood that. He also understood something else. Silence, when chosen carefully, is not weakness. It is timing. Outside the boardroom, beyond the glass, Lily waited in the hallway chair, feet no longer swinging. The door opened, and Daniel stepped out to meet her. The hallway felt quieter than it should have. Not peaceful, just suspended. Lily stood when she saw him, searching his face the way children do when adults pretend everything is fine. "Are you in trouble?" she asked softly. Daniel set his notebook down on the chair and knelt in front of her. The corporate floor was polished marble, cold through his trousers. "No," he said gently. "I'm not in trouble." She studied him another second. "I did what Mom would have done," he added. That seemed to settle something in her. She nodded once, as if that was the only metric that mattered. Behind them, the boardroom door opened again. Conversations drifted out in low, controlled tones. Investors moved past without making eye contact. A few glanced at Daniel differently, now not dismissively, but carefully. Victoria stepped into the hallway last. She dismissed the others with a subtle gesture and walked toward him without haste. No entourage, no performance. Daniel stood. For a moment, the three of them existed in a strange triangle: authority, accountability, and a child who understood more than either of them realized. Victoria's gaze softened slightly when it landed. "On Lily. You must be Lily," she said. Lily nodded. "You were very patient today." "I can be invisible," Lily replied. The faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Victoria's expression. Then she looked back at Daniel. "You should have been leading that presentation," she said. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't praise. It was recalibration. Daniel didn't respond immediately. Victoria folded her arms, not defensively, but thoughtfully. "I inherited this role during a federal investigation," she said. 5 years ago. The company was bleeding credibility. Every disagreement inside the executive team became a leak risk. Every objection felt like sabotage. She glanced toward the boardroom doors. "I learned to equate dissent with threat." Daniel listened, not interrupting. "That's not an excuse," she added. "It's context." The hallway air hummed faintly with distant elevator chimes. "I misjudged you," she said plainly. "And I nearly misjudged the data." There was no drama in her voice, just precision. "Compliance needs independence," she continued. "Real independence. Direct reporting line to the board. Full audit. Authority, no override without documented concurrence." She held his gaze. "I want you to lead it." The offer hung heavier than the one in her office earlier. Not a quiet reframing, not narrative. Control. Structural authority. Daniel felt Lily's small hand slip into his. Full autonomy meant protection for the system he had built. It also meant deeper entanglement in the institution that had laughed at him. "You'd have contractual protection," Victoria added. Board-backed. Trust, rewritten on paper. He thought of the override logs, of Marcus escorted out without resistance, of how close the vote had come. "Why?" he asked finally. "Because you were willing to lose," she said. "That's rare." He considered that. Security for Lily. Integrity preserved. But institutions remember disruptions, even when they publicly endorse them. "I'll need time," he said. Victoria nodded once. "Take it." She extended her hand, not ceremonially, not urgently, simply as acknowledgement. After a brief pause, he shook it. Not submission, not victory. Agreement to consider as she walked away. The hallway felt less suspended and more transitional-like. Something old had loosened but not yet fallen away. Lily looked up at him. "Does that mean you're the boss now?" she asked. He exhaled softly. "No," he said. "It means we have a decision to make." They walked toward the elevator together, hand in hand. Reflections stretching along the polished floor. Behind them, the boardroom doors closed. Ahead of them, the future remained undecided. Several weeks later, the answer would begin to take shape. The independent audit took 6 weeks. It confirmed every projection, disclosure gaps, suppressed flags, exposure probabilities within 2% of Daniel's model. The merger didn't collapse. It was restructured. Transparent amendments, revised valuations, full variance reporting, slower, cleaner, ethical. Daniel accepted the role. Compliance now reported directly to the board. No override without dual authorization. Architecture reinforced instead of hidden. Lily visited again on a quiet Friday afternoon. No laughter this time. Assistants offered her juice. Analysts waved. The glass walls felt less like barriers and more like windows. Victoria stepped out of her office when she saw her. "Good to see you again, Lily," she said respectfully. That night, at home, the apartment was still. Lily fell asleep on the couch. A book open on her chest. Don Daniel sat beside her and turned the wedding ring slowly around his finger. After a long moment, he removed it, not to forget Claire, but to carry her forward differently. He set it gently on the table. Not an ending, a continuation. Quiet strength, restored balance.